All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Mallory Howard. I'm the assistant curator here at the Mark Twain House. So I want to welcome all of you that are here in person, and then welcome everyone who is watching from home to tonight's event. And so I'm going to tell you briefly about our two speakers, and then we'll get started. So about the author, Bill Shaffer holds an MA in History of Design and Curatorial Studies from Parsons, the New School in New York. He is the author of Emotion in Motion 55 Behringer Displays. Shaffer has been published on designobserver.com and the online site of Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum, where he was a Smithsonian Fellow. Shaffer has worked as a research assistant for Paul Goldberger on his book Ballpark, Baseball in the American City, and for Laura Occhio's book, Contribution to a Friend of the Cause, Lafayette and the Anti-Slavery Movement. So please join me in welcoming Bill Shaffer. So talking with him tonight is Steve Courtney, who has a long time and cherished association with the Mark Twain House and Museum, where he has served in many capacities, including roles in curatorial, interpretation, publicity, writing, editing, research, and programming. He is a former editor with the Hartford Courant and has written several books, including Joseph Hopkins Twitchell, The Life and Times of Mark Twain's Closest Friend, The Loveliest Home There Ever Was, The Story of the Mark Twain House, We Shall Have Them With Us Always, The Ghosts of the Mark Twain House, and Mark Twain's Hartford. Steve is co-editor of the Civil War Letters of Joseph Hopkins Twitchell, A Chaplain Story. So welcome to Steve. And at the very end of their discussion, we are going to be doing a Q&A. So while they're having a conversation, please start thinking about some interesting questions that you can ask our prestigious author here tonight. So with that, I will let you gentlemen get started.
Well, thank you, Mallory. I appreciate the introductions, both of them. I'm very glad to have Bill here. He has written a wonderful book that has this relation to Mark Twain. It's a story of the Gilded Age. And the Gilded Age is a term that the gifted wordsmith who once lived here devised, perhaps along with his co-author on the novel The Gilded Age, Charles Dudley Warner, who was his neighbor here. But it's a wonderful novel of Washington corruption. And corruption is something that Bill's book is also about, a different kind of corruption, perhaps. It's the Scandalous Hamiltons, and we're not talking, of course, about Alexander Hamilton, but we're talking about his great-grandson, a figure of the Gilded Age. When the scandal that he wrote about happened, the New York World Report described it as one of the most astounding stories of conspiracy, of turpitude, of plot and counterplot ever revealed outside the realm of improbable fiction. And a more recent reviewer said that if John Grisham had heard this story, he would have considered it too improbable for a novel by lunchtime.
That's right.
So tell us about this scandal, Bill. What's happening here?
So the two main characters in the book are a gentleman named Robert Ray Hamilton. He is a great-grandson of Alexander Hamilton, and a woman who, her name was Eva. She used many surnames in her lifetime. She was born Evangeline Steele. They were they came from two completely different backgrounds. Robert Ray Hamilton, everybody called him Ray Hamilton, was the son of Schuyler Hamilton, who was a Civil War general. His grandfather was John Church Hamilton, who was a biographer and historian about his own father, Alexander Hamilton. And by the 1880s, the Hamilton family was firmly entrenched and were high-profile people in New York society. So they had a lot of money. They owned a lot of real estate. They were connected with other very well-to-do families. And Ray and his brother, Schuyler Jr., grew up in great privilege. They never lacked for anything. They went to Columbia University. Ray then went on to Columbia Law School. He was a New York State Assemblyman. Some people might have thought he had an eye on higher office. And so Ray is on one side. Eva was born in the sort of backwoods of northeast Pennsylvania, around Scranton, Wilkes-Barre. Her father was an itinerant logger, an alcoholic. She was the youngest of 6 kids. She wasn't educated much past the sort of 4th or 6th grade. The townspeople, or the people in her village, thought she wasn't going to be too bright. And somehow, Ray and Eva found each other. We can get into how they found each other in a little bit, but they really, the Gilded Age, there were people accumulating massive amounts of wealth, right? I mean, the robber barons and all of those names that we associate with the Gilded Age. But the flip side of that, there were a lot of people who were breaking their backs, building railroads, digging out coal, cutting trails through the forest for these trains to go through, like Eva's father, that were basically fueling the wealth of the robber barons. So Ray and Eva were sort of personified both sides of that Gilded Age coin, in that extreme wealth and extreme poverty. So those two forces come together in the book. So.
Yeah. Well, before we get on to the details of the scandal, I will try to avoid spoilers, because obviously you've got to buy this book. So just go ahead and you'll learn all about it. But you found this story near your apartment in New York in a very interesting way.
Yeah, when people ask how did you find the book, my response is that the book kind of found me. My wife and I owned a house in Westport, Connecticut, raised a daughter there, and in 2017 we were empty nesters. We had met in the city. My wife grew up in the city, and so we decided to take an apartment in New York and see what the city had to offer. I had worked there, commuted in and out every day for 30 years, and we took an apartment on the Upper West Side. And we moved in November of 2017. About 2 months later, in January, it was a freezing cold night, one of those 10-degree nights. I had to move our car to be on the right side for alternate street parking, and I found a parking spot in front of a fountain at the corner of 76th Street and Riverside Drive. And I got out of the car, and I thought, that's a beautiful fountain. That seems like something you would see at Grand Central Terminal. And Grand Central is my favorite building in New York. I do architectural research, and that building was designed by Warren and Wetmore, very prolific, very influential architecture firm in the early part of the 20th century. And so I went to read the Parks Department plaque. I mean, I'm freezing, but it's, what is this fountain? And, Robert Ray Hamilton, great-grandson of Alexander Hamilton, scandal, fountain designed by Warren and Wetmore. I thought, So I started walking briskly 4 blocks home, thinking, why is Warren and Wetmore involved in this obscure little fountain in this obscure corner of Riverside Park? They did buildings like Grand Central, right? They didn't do fountains that weren't much bigger than the center of the stage. And so I started just cursory Google searches, and one thing led to another. I found some blog posts, and then I was fortunate enough to find some court records. And at the New York Historical Society Library was a box of letters of people who wrote to Ray Hamilton in his time of need. And I thought, well, there's got to be a book about this someplace. And when I looked and didn't find one, I said, okay, I'm going to write it. So that's how it came about.
And you do get right into your story with the tale of a wedding in New Jersey
Right.
in January 1889. And this is where things get underway.
This is where things start to, we don't know it quite in January, but that is the beginning of the unraveling of Ray and Eva's relationship.
And they have known each other for how long by then?
About 4 years. They met in 1885.
In a place of ill repute.
They did. Prostitution was pretty common in New York at that time, and it wasn't necessarily thought of by a lot of people as being particularly wrong or immoral. I mean, there were a lot of prostitutes, and for men of Ray's stature, it wasn't uncommon to work all day, make a lot of money, go to one of your private clubs and meet your friends for dinner and drinks, the union, league or the university club, and you kind of swing by a house of ill repute, a bawdy house it might be called, on your way home. And one evening he did that and met Eva. And Ray, because of his role with the state assembly, he was in Albany quite a bit, so he was basically in New York on the weekends. And when he was in New York, he saw Eva. And then Monday morning, he'd go back to Albany, and that was the end of their relationship for that time. So it was a part-time relationship for 4 years, and then things got a lot more serious.
And he was not married.
He was not, had never been married.
So, well, we again avoiding spoilers, but why did they get married at last?
In the summer of 1888, so this is now 6 months before they get married, Eva announced to Ray that she was pregnant with his child, and that for him to be a man of morally upstanding character, he should marry her. And he didn't say yes at the time. Everything just kind of kept going. But what happened to women at that time, the last 3 months of a pregnancy were called a laying-in period. And a lot of times that would be done at your mother's house. It could be done in a hospital, but a lot of times it was done in, say, a woman's mother's house or an aunt. You were off of your feet. You were basically bed rest for those last 2 or 3 months. And it was not uncommon for women to kind of disappear from their spouse or their intended for that laying-in period. So in the fall of 2088, she told Ray, I'm going to Elmira. 1888, right? That she's going to
Elmira, another Mark Twain connection.
There you go. To stay with her mother, and when she comes back around the first of the year 1889, she will bring his child with her. And she brought a child at the beginning of 1889, told Ray, this is your daughter. They named her Beatrice, and Ray and Eva got married the next week, January 7th. So I don't know how much farther you want to go with the baby part.
Well, without giving too much away, there were things called baby farms.
There were baby farms. They were essentially, not essentially, they were illegal orphanages. If you were a woman or a girl who found yourself pregnant, wanted to deliver your baby, but not keep your baby, you could go to a legitimate orphanage, which were normally run by either a church, a religious group, or a government institution. There was a certain amount of paperwork, registration, and all of that to kind of turn over your baby, or you could go to a place which was called a baby farm. It was essentially a midwife who took in babies that women or girls didn't want. And it's actually the saddest part of the research that went into the book is that these babies were abandoned to these midwives. Babies that were rosy-cheeked and looked healthy and normal could be then sold. You could come in and you could buy a baby, no questions asked, for $5 or $10 maximum. The babies that they might have a physical deformity, they might show some form of not quite functioning in a normal way. Oftentimes they were victims of infanticide, and it's sad, but they would be smothered, they could be drowned, they could be disposed of. But if you wanted a baby and you had the money, you could get one, as easily as you could.
So then the things happened rather rapidly in this new marriage. His money was in real estate, right?
His money was in real estate.
Yeah.
Around that time, he owned about 32 properties in Manhattan and Brooklyn, developed properties and vacant lots that were ready to build. But shortly after they got married, they left for San Diego for 4 months. San Diego, the trains had just started coming to San Diego about 4 years before that. San Diego was thought of as this undeveloped paradise, and for a real estate developer, all of this coastline property was basically up for grabs. So they went there for several months. Eva didn't like being away from the East Coast. She lost about 40 pounds. She went from about 150 pounds down to just over 100 pounds. She was not well. She started drinking heavily. And so Ray and Eva took a decision to return to the East Coast in the summer of that year. I should add that they hired a baby nurse, a woman named Mary Ann Donnelly, to accompany them to San Diego, and then she returned with them, and they were going to stop in Atlantic City for about 4 or 6 weeks, and then return to New York to take up residence again. So
they went to this resort.
there were 2 levels of resorts in Atlantic City. There were the big oceanfront grand hotels. If you wanted more privacy or a little bit more discerning kind of accommodation, there were the sort of side streets off the beach had these quaint Victorian cottages, only 4 or 6 rooms, very private, et cetera, et cetera. And so they took a room at a place called Knoll Cottage. The baby nurse, Mary Ann Donnelly, Ray and Eva had never spent that much time together continuously in the almost 5 years of their relationship. And Ray was getting pretty tired of Eva. She constant demands for money. She wanted to be turned out in the finest clothes all the time, jewelry, and she was always after him kind of about something. And they were about ready to go back to New York, and he said, you know what, I want a divorce. Eva did not want a divorce. From where she had come from in life, to be married and have access to that Hamilton money was not something that she was very keen to give up on at all. And so they had a very loud argument, woke up the entire cottage, and Mary Ann Donnelly inserted herself into the situation. She intimated to Ray that Eva, not everything was on the up and up with Eva, that she had friends that Ray didn't know about. Beatrice was, questionable, her origin, and Eva stabbed her in a drunken brawl. Took what was called a Mexican dagger out of a trunk and stabbed her. Missed her intestines by 1/8 of an inch. Mary Ann Donnelly survived, but Eva was arrested on account of atrocious assault, and that's really when the whole thing fell apart, because this happened at noon, at lunchtime. By that night, reporters from New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore had descended on Atlantic City. The whole town was in a stir about it, both tourists and locals, and it created national headlines. By the next morning, it was front page news in virtually every newspaper in the country that a descendant of Alexander Hamilton was caught in this scandal with his wife, an adventuress and killer. And that
really gets
that kicks off this is all sort of the first chapter that we're talking about, and then it goes from there. So,
and this was the time when the yellow press was developing.
Yeah, it was,
including Joseph Pulitzer, after whom the prize is.
Joseph Pulitzer had bought the New York World several years before, and back to this Gilded Age division of haves and have-nots. There was no real newspaper for the working man, for the people like Eva's father. There wasn't that voice, and the World became that voice. Later, Hearst came in his paper and all of that stuff as well, but it was a way for immigrants, people who were down on their luck, working man, to take a look at what was going on with the rich, the moneyed class, and you could revel in them getting their comeuppance. It was like, see, they're not that different than us. They bad things can happen to them too. And so as a result, and so this story was tailor-made for that, to kind of play up those divisions of haves and have-nots. This was just a wedge that just drove right in the middle of that whole thing. So.
Yeah. One thing Bill has is this wonderful bibliography, which includes probably more newspaper articles than you'll ever see in the average bibliography. And I'm just going to read you a very few of them. Eva and the baby, Philadelphia Inquirer. Eva asked for morphine. These are things that happened over the next part of the book, so some of them won't make sense. Eva at the footlights. Eva begins her fight. Eva drops her mask. Eva Hamilton at bay. Eva Hamilton free again. Eva Hamilton makes answer. Eva Hamilton married. Eva Hamilton's debut on the stage. Eva has her champions. Anyway, it goes on and on. I'm only reading like a tenth of those. So, yes, at this point on, it turns into quite a lot of courtroom scenes.
Yeah,
a lot of
it's now a media sensation story. We think about, today something happens and, 5 hours later there's satellite trucks lined up down the street and breaking news crawls across the bottom of the screen. All of those feelings were the same then. There was just only one outlet for them, and that was the daily newspaper. And most newspapers were published in editions of 8 pages at the time. And so a front page of a newspaper, there were no photographs. very little use of illustration. So a front page of a newspaper might have 20 small articles, just a sea of text on it. And here comes Ray and Eva Hamilton. They're commanding full-length, full columns on the front page, and articles that continued on to the interior pages, which was virtually unheard of. So, and part of it was due to, and I write in the book that the Hamilton name then was sort of like the Kennedy name today. You know, it's, even though we're 60 years past Dallas and everything, when you hear the Kennedy name in the news, our ears perk up. It's like, oh, what are the Kennedys up to? And the Hamiltons were much that way. It was 80 years after Alexander Hamilton was shot in the duel, but because of their prominence in New York society and their philanthropic efforts and all of that, you heard the name Hamilton quite often, and most of the time you heard it in connection with doing good for other people, and you didn't hear it in this context. So this gave it even a more sensational tone. So.
And to top it off, the minister who married them, his last name was Burr.
His last name was Burr. He was no relationship. He was no relation to Aaron Burr. But yeah, exactly.
Cosmic. Right?
Yeah. So, in fact, when they went to get married, they told nobody because of the origins of their relationship. And in fact, the minister's wife and mother-in-law acted as the two witnesses to sign the marriage certificate.
So, well, we're going to leave people hanging on what happened next. And I'm going to ask you...
I wish I could tell you everything. I really do.
Well, there's a lot there. We might talk about it a little, but I mean, there's a mysterious death out west. There's all kinds of things in this story. But I actually wanted to ask you about your research. I mean, your bibliography is tremendous. Each character seems to get almost a mini profile of the characters who come in.
Right.
And so you've done a massive amount of research, really.
Yeah, one thing that, well, as I started getting deeper and deeper into the story, I kept finding things, and I would read them, newspaper accounts or things, and I would say, this can't be true. This couldn't have happened. There's no way this is true. And the more I went, it's like, whoa, it is true. It actually did happen. And so I wanted to make sure that anything I was saying in the book, I didn't want a reader to think he's just making that up. There's no way that can be true. So I wanted to make sure that I had everything accounted for. And there are a number of characters that appear in the book. They're not the central cast of Ray and Eva, but a future Nobel Prize winner, a doctor who co-invented the electric chair, a distant cousin of John Singer Sargent, the painter. So all of these people somehow find their way into this story. And so I thought that they needed at least a little bit of explanation as to kind of who they were and how they fit into this funny puzzle. And to do that, I just had to dig. I wanted to, it's one thing you can like a writer's style, or not. Some have more appeal than others, whatever. That's a matter of individual taste. But I didn't want to tell the story in a way that left it open to a reader thinking he's just making stuff up here. So I wanted to make sure that I had myself in
Well, that's pretty clear. Just without getting too far into it, a good crime story always has a detective, and I love the character of Tommy Burns. You want to talk about
He is a legendary figure. if you've ever watched the show The Alienist, or if you've read the book The Alienist by Caleb Carr, Tommy Burns plays a role in that. He was a big, beefy guy. He was the chief of detectives for the New York Police Department. He's credited with he kept a book of known criminal photographs on his desk that he called the Rogues Gallery, which is basically the forerunner of today's mugshot book. He invented what we now know as the third degree, which is a combination of physical and psychological techniques to interrogate witnesses. And the police headquarters was on Mulberry Street, and he wanted to make sure that any criminal who was arrested was walked around Mulberry Street so that everybody could see who they were and see if they could detach them to any other crimes. And it basically was the forerunner of what we call today the perp walk. So he was an incredible sort of police mind. He was also incredibly corrupt. He had a salary of $5,000 a year. His wife had a bank account with $290,000 in it. When asked about it, he said, "Those are gratuities that Wall Street businessmen pay me for keeping criminals away from them." So it was the time of Tammany Hall, and basically everybody, it was just rife with graft. And actually, when Teddy Roosevelt was appointed the police commissioner for New York City in 1892, I'm not sure if I got that date right. He was named commissioner to root out all of the corruption in the New York Police Department, and his first order of business was to get Tommy Burns. He knew that Burns was at the center of everything, so he gave Burns an offer. "You can retire with a full pension today. If you fight it, I'm going to take you down. You won't see a penny." So of course he took it, but it was said that six hoodlums couldn't plan a heist in New York without two of them being in Tommy's pocket. He kind of was on both sides of the law, but he's the one who cracked the grander conspiracy of Eva and two partners, essentially, and what they were up to and what their ultimate plans were to make Ray Hamilton's life difficult. So Tommy was at the middle of everything. So if you watch The Alienist, you see him within there. But he was a character, so that's for sure.
And the plot, as I mentioned, involves a mysterious death out west. Did you go to Jackson Hole?
I did.
You did.
I actually, when I mentioned earlier, our daughter moved out of the house. She ended up living in Jackson Hole while I was writing the book. But beyond that, I have a friend that I've known since we were 8 years old, who, when we got out of college, he went to live to work as a summer job in the Grand Teton National Park, and never came back. So he's lived out there for 40 years. So we've been out there to see from his wedding and things like that. So I knew it a little bit, but when I wrote the part about it, I looked at some contemporary sources for what kind of wildlife, what kind of flowers, and I wrote to my friend Marty to say, "Can you take a look at this and make sure? I don't want to look like I'm saying something stupid." And so, for instance, I said Ray arrived in Jackson Hole in June of 1890, and the valley floor was alive with the electric blooms of Indian paintbrush flowers. He wrote back, "Those don't bloom until July. You're going to have to say that they're arrowroot balsam flowers." All right, change that. I said, if a fisherman dropped his line in the water, it could be met by rainbow trout or cutthroat trout. He said rainbow trout aren't native to the area. They were introduced by the Park Service in 1930. So when Ray was there, so thankfully I had some
You had,
inside information
local,
on the flora and fauna.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And were there any sort of major, well, obvious, other than finding the fountain in the first place, were there any major surprises that you came across in this
In
process of writing the book?
major surprises, that's a little bit of a tough one. They were a series of ongoing, I would say, minor surprises. I think maybe the biggest surprise or revelation to me, I guess, maybe is that both sides, Ray and Eva, there's a criminal proceeding in the book. There's a series of civil proceedings in the book. So there's a number of sort of courtroom scenes. But what I was surprised at was the way both sides, Ray's side and Eva's side, used the press to influence the court of public opinion. There would be closed-door depositions taken in a part of the case. Somehow they would be leaked to the press on one side. Then, the next day, another part of the deposition would be leaked by the other side to their advantage. So there was this strict sort of legal proceedings, but there was very much how you win the court of popular opinion, and that's much the way both sides in politics or any kind of story today try to court the press to woo you to their side of the story. And it surprised me that there was that much of that going on at the same time.
And then, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know if it's a major surprise, but it definitely struck me as something that was
One of the more interesting.
Yeah.
It sounds like it was a bit of an education, because this, this is one, when you describe court proceedings, various things, you often describe the building in which they're in. For Atlantic City's imposing city hall stood 2 blocks north of Knoll Cottage at the corner of Tennessee and Atlantic Avenues. Framing the entrance to its 4-story Romanesque facade, a clock tower rose another 40 feet above the top floor offices, capped by a steeply pitched copper roof. So now you're an architectural researcher and have written books on design, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
So it's very hard for me to keep the architecture out of it.
That's interesting. What can I just diverge a little bit to ask you what I know you worked with Paul Goldberger, as Mallory mentioned.
If you're into architectural, Paul Goldberger is preeminent architectural critic in New York. I was a student of his not long ago, and I started doing research work for him. And his last book was about ballparks, not sort of what ballparks look like, but how ballparks started and baseball parks started in cities, moved to suburbs, how they came back into cities, et cetera, et cetera. So I've done quite a bit of work for him, not only on that book, but outside of it. And I've always been a fan of architecture, so it's there. And in fact, before Robert Ray Hamilton was even on my radar, it was Warren and Wetmore. I wanted to know why Warren and Wetmore was involved in this story, not them. So yeah, it's definitely part of my interest.
Your lifelong interest.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, I'm told that we have a little time for questions coming up from you guys and from the virtual audience. Shall we begin? And what you're supposed to do is wait until the microphone gets to you so that the people at home can hear what you're asking.
Hello there. I'm going to pass the microphone to you and say your name.
Start there.
Hi, my name is Jenna, And I'm curious too now, why did they do the fountain? What was the purpose of having a fountain?
So Robert Ray Hamilton left $10,000 in his will to build a fountain suitable for man and beast. It was actually a horse trough fountain, that was a popular philanthropic thing to do in those days. Now, Ray ends up not living a full life, but when he died, it took about 16 years to get the fountain built. The family was bitterly opposed to it. In fact, they went to the New York Times to plant a story saying that the city can keep the money. We don't want the $10,000. You do whatever you want with it. Whatever you do, don't build a fountain with the Hamilton name on it. They felt Ray had disgraced the family.
They said, let him be forgotten.
Let him be forgotten, exactly. And the city said, we can't by law do that. So they basically slow-walked the approval process for the site and the design of it until Ray's father died. Ray's father died in 1904, and a month after he died, the city approved the site for the fountain. Now, of course, not irony, but the funny part of it is by 1906, automobiles on Riverside Drive have already started to replace horses. And so certainly by, 5 years later, not a lot of horses clopping up and down Riverside Drive, but that was the intention of it, so, yeah.
I think I saw a question.
Yeah, first we're going to take one from our virtual audience. We have a question from John, and he wants to know, after setting on a topic or subject, how does one organize the vast amount of research that is necessary to write a book at this level of detail?
Good question.
We're going to have to start all over again. No, you have to, this will probably be a lousy analogy, but if you think of, going to a food buffet and you want to try everything, right? But you have to sort of start taking it in small digestible pieces. And you might have your own technique, but I just take whatever I find and put it in a bucket. I try not to decide whether this is good, bad, useful, confusing, whatever. It's just whatever the topic is or the person is, put it in that bucket and then start trying to kind of then wade through those and figure out at a second level what makes sense or what doesn't. But you just have to, or at least for me, that's what works, is just trying to gather up everything that I can, not try to edit myself, but just get it in a place where I can come back to it when I think I might need it. So.
Okay, we have a live question.
Hi.
In
I don't know if you
person.
can hear me. My name is Barbara, and I'm curious as to the ages of Eva and Ray when they met, and also what happened to the baby. Can you tell us, or is that a spoiler?
Yeah. So when Ray and Eva got married in 1889, Ray was 38 and she was 26. The average age for marriage at that time, they were both quite old to be being married for the first time. The average age for men was around 27, 28 years old, and the average age for women was around 20 or 21. So by statistical standards, they were pushing it, that they had never been married before. In terms of what happened to Beatrice, it was I couldn't find what happened to Beatrice for a long time. She ended up being kind of moved around from guardian to guardian. It was a very tough first 10 or so years of her life. And at a certain point, I thought I had a hunch of a name that I thought might be her, and I found somebody to contact. They in the end requested anonymity, so I don't want to reveal too much, but I reached out to them to say, is this person, could this have been Beatrice Ray Hamilton? And basically they came back to say yes, and she ended up living, she changed her name at a very early age, by the time she was probably 15 or 16. Lived as far away from New York and Atlantic City as one could possibly live in the United States. Lived a full life, by all accounts had kids and grandkids. And I reached out to the family, and I write it in the end of the book. I reached out to the family to ask, would any descendants be interested in talking to me, sharing any photographs that might exist, any memorabilia, ephemera from her life that might shed some light. And they wrote back to say, Beatrice had a very difficult life, a very difficult beginning to her life, and she spent most of the rest of it trying to forget those early years. And so, out of respect for those wishes, I kept it all anonymous. But she did okay. After a very rough start, she ended up on the West Coast and with a family, and by all accounts, a normal life. The beginning of her life was anything but. So, yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was a notable example of reportorial discretion in holding back.
I kind of went back and forth with it, because I think if you were a hard-hitting investigative reporter, you would kind of, and only because I had read so much about Beatrice and all these trials and tribulations and that were happening with Ray and Eva, and here's this poor infant who has not chosen her lot in life at all, but she's just literally getting bounced around from person to person. And I felt bad for her, and I didn't feel right pursuing that further than I did.
And the first person to take care of her was the woman who rented out Knoll Cottage to the
That's correct.
family, right?
When this stabbing happened and Eva's going to go on trial and Ray is, I'm getting the hell out of here. I'm leaving Atlanta. He left the baby in the care of the proprietress of the cottage, a woman named Mrs. Rupp. And when you speak about using the press, so now all the press has just descended on Atlantic City. They're everywhere. And Ray had said, I'll pay you to take care of Beatrice. I'll come back, but I can't deal with this right now. I'll pay you. And he wasn't paying her enough. So she realized how people use the newspapers. So she called the reporters to Knoll Cottage to say, hey, by the way, I've still got Ray's baby, and do you know how much he's paying me? And the reporters said, no, $50. How much do you think it's worth? I think I should be paid $500. So she was using the press herself. It's just everybody did. So
What a story.
yeah.
Who else?
Hi, yep, my name is Mary. So many fascinating pieces to the story. A little bit more about you, the author, Bill. I find it really interesting how you came upon the story when you were out moving your car from the to the even side of the street, and you see that statue. And tell me about you and how you became enamored through the architect of the statue, who was the same architect of Grand Central Station.
So, yeah, thanks
Thank
for
you.
asking. I am not a writer by background. I spent 35 years in the design business in New York. In the fashion and beauty industry, I spent most of my time designing department store makeup counters for big famous makeup brands. And in 2015, circumstances of life conspired to find me in a corporate reorganization, and I made a decision to return to graduate school. And so at a ripe young age, I returned to graduate school to study the history of design. I did it at Parsons at the New School, and that program is run in conjunction with the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum. So you work in the museum, you study in there, et cetera, et cetera. It's a great education. You learn to do very rigorous research, not settling for secondary sources when primary sources are available, things like that. Making sure that you can corroborate the various aspects, but you also have to write a lot. And I had always sort of toyed around with writing, maybe a little bit of a Sunday writer, had ideas for things, never pursued publishing anything, but I realized that I really liked writing. You know, I was 55, most of the kids in the program were 25, and it's like, oh, I got to do a 10-page paper, I got to do a 20-page, and I'm like, yeah, 20 pages, let's go. So I really liked writing. I thought, I've got to find something to write about. And architecture and design, those are all my interests. And I had planned on maybe trying to write some shorter form essays, design issue kind of stuff. And this book just, I mean, it just presented itself. So I had to write it. So, yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Any more?
We have one last question that got sent to me is, are you working on a next book? And if so, what is it?
The answer is yes, but I can't tell you. All I can say is it's a gentleman who was described as the most accomplished and unscrupulous man you'll ever meet.
Is it U.S., United States?
That's it. That's all That's it. I think we're out of time.
I can think of a few who might fit that description, but it might be a hard contest these days. So,
Well, if there's no further questions, we have one more. You got it?
Just, mic's working now?
Okay.
Hi, my name is Orshi, and I have a two-part scandal question.
Okay.
I haven't read the book, and I really appreciate no more spoiler alerts.
Okay.
But from what you understand from that period, if they were to just get a divorce and that would have been the scandal, would that have been a scandal? Would it have been appropriate and acceptable at the time?
It wouldn't have been a deep scandal. However, divorce was uncommon at that time. It wasn't as prevalent as it is today, mainly because it was extremely prohibitive from a cost point of view. Only the very wealthiest could afford to be divorced, actually. But what was tricky about it is once you were married, a woman was entitled to a third of a man's estate. She had dower rights. It varied from state to state, but the minimum was a third. In some places it was up to a half of his estate. So there was really no incentive. Well, I shouldn't say there was no financial incentive. I mean, obviously, if a woman is being beaten and is in a place where she's just got to get out of it for her own safety, that's one thing. But from a financial point of view, it was actually, there was more incentive for a woman to stay in a marriage because she automatically got a third of at least a third of the estate, regardless of what happened. And so that plays a role in the book.
And then, if I may, the second part of the question is, had they not have had a bad marriage, so assuming they were happily married and the scandal is what the story ends up being, knowing that there was money and power and corruption involved, had he wanted to, could Ray have made this go away? In your opinion, without actually becoming a scandal?
He might have been able to. He had some very influential friends. The way that rich and powerful people sometimes are able to have things swept under rugs. It could have been, but in theory, it could have been. But it just happened so fast and so unexpectedly and in such a weird reason, with him not doing anything but his wife stabbing a baby nurse. It was unpredictable, and it was a wildfire of scandalous news before he could barely, kind of comprehend what had just happened to him. So it's a tough one to answer. Theoretically, yes, he had the power, money, and connections to do something like that, but it was just never an option for him.
So we have one more question that we're going to end with that I have virtually, but Rebecca's going to swap mics with you really quick because your lapel one is not working as well anymore.
Sorry
So
about that.
the last question, besides the fountain as a result of the story, are there any of the notable original structures still in existence today?
Notable original structures. Let's see, I have to think through that. Actually, the jail and the sheriff's house in Mays County, in Mays Landing, are still there.
New Jersey.
In New Jersey. And in fact, Eva spends time in jail in Mays Landing, which is a little town outside of Atlantic City, and she is, the sheriff's wife took a liking to her and said, you don't have to stay in the jail with these creepy men, criminals. You can stay in the attic of our house until this is all resolved. Which she did, and there were two young boys living in the house. The sheriff was a gentleman named Smith Johnson, and the older brother was Nucky Johnson. And if you watch the show Boardwalk Empire, and the guy that was Nucky Thompson, who was the kingpin of Atlantic City during Prohibition, that's actually Nucky Johnson. And then his brother was the sheriff in Atlantic City. So Eva spent time with a very young Nucky Johnson. So that building is still there. Boy, I'd have to go through the list, but I'm sure there are some of them that are still out there.
Well,
All right. Well, thank you very much. I want to give a round of applause and a big thank you to Bill and Steve. And thank all of you, both in person and virtual, for attending tonight. For those of you in person, Bill will be autographing copies of the Scandalous Hamiltons outside of our museum store. You can still go in and buy your copy because obviously you have to read more and find out what happened. For those of you watching virtually, the link is in the chat, so you can click on that and purchase your order from our bookshop as well, and yours will also be signed and we will ship it out to you. So with that, thank you very much. And one more round of applause.